3 years into its full-scale assault on Ukraine, Russia is discovering the hard limits of waging a long war with a constrained economy. What initially looked like remarkable economic resilience has now given way to visible structural weakness, slowing growth, rising inflation, a widening deficit, and severe pressure on the Kremlin's principal source of revenue. The financial foundation of Vladimir Putin's war machine is no longer secure. For a time, high commodity prices masked the damage. Oil and gas revenues soared in 2022 and 2023. Wartime spending stimulated output, and Moscow diverted exports from Europe to Asia with astonishing speed. But this was always a short-term strategy. Russia's economic stamina has begun to falter, and the most significant indicator is the sudden decline in oil revenues. New US sanctions targeting Rosneft and Lukoil have changed the calculus for Russia's two main customers, India and China. Both have sharply reduced purchases to avoid secondary sanctions, switching towards Saudi supply. The Kremlin is now forced to sell at steeper discounts, travelling longer routes with an aging and risky shadow fleet of tankers. Russian Ural crude has sunk to its lowest prices since the early months of the war. This matters profoundly. Oil and gas historically account for around 30% of federal reserves, revenues. When these collapse, the budget follows. Russia now faces a deficit of roughly 3% of GDP, the largest since 2022, and this understates the exposure. The Kremlin has locked itself into record military expenditure. Almost 40% of the 2026 federal budget will fund the war and the security apparatus that sustains it. Social spending is being cut, economic development is being cut, Moscow is rubbing tomorrow to pay for today's artillery shells. To plug the deficit, the government has broken promises not to raise taxes. VAT rises in January, tax breaks for small businesses are scrapped, duties on imported vehicles and technology have increased. These measures will squeeze ordinary Russians while doing nothing to make the economy more productive. The result is a more angry, poorer population and a state ever more dependent on coercion to maintain loyalty. Meanwhile, Russia is depleting assets it cannot replenish. Before the war, Moscow boasted the world's fifth largest gold reserves, but sanctions and a currency under strain have forced accelerated sales. 2/3 of the National Wealth Fund's liquid assets have been burned through since 2022. Russia is now selling physical gold from its central reserves, often through opaque channels that allow it to sidestep sanctions. Even the Kremlin admits that gold is functioning as cash for everything from international weapons payments to laundering and organized crime. Oil under pressure, gold drained, diamonds sanctioned, coals collapsing. These suggest a country bending under its own economic contradictions. Inflation remains stubbornly high, interest rates approach 20%, throttling investment and household borrowing. The labour market is distorted by mobilisation and emigration, with many regions facing acute shortages of skilled workers. Basic goods run short because trucks and fuel are diverted to the front. The political implications are profound. For most Russians, the war has become synonymous with rising prices, declining services, and fewer life opportunities. They see the Western living standard as rising while their own are falling. That psychological shift matters. Regimes do not fall when they are poor. They fall when people realize they've been made poorer than they should be. Putin's strategic bind is becoming clear. He built his authority on a bargain. Stability in exchange for obedience, but stability is gone. Wartime propaganda promises victory, but the economy signals exhaustion. Russia cannot raise taxes indefinitely, it cannot keep burning its resolves, and it cannot assume that China will subsidize its war effort forever. Which leads us to the central question: how long can the Kremlin finance defeat, stalemate, or marginal military gains? The answer is shortening by the month. Even Putin's closest business allies have begun quietly hinting at the need for negotiation. There is no surplus to rebuild domestic legitimacy or restore public confidence. There is only strain. For Western policymakers, the lesson is straightforward. Continued pressure works. Sanctions that restrict energy revenues work. Limiting access to capital, technology and shipping works. Ukraine's targeted drone strikes on Russian fuel infrastructure work. We're no longer speculating about economic pain. It's measurable, visible and politically consequential. To be clear, a weakened Russia is not yet a defeated one. The Kremlin still commands vast resources and a population forced into compliance, but the political economy of this war has turned decisively against Moscow. Russia is heading towards a moment where the rational choice is to stop. That moment must not be wasted. Our task is to ensure that Ukraine, not Russia, shapes the conditions of peace. The path to that outcome does not rely on hope or rhetoric, but on a sustained strategy, tightening sanctions on oil exports, blocking illicit gold and diamond flows, supporting Ukraine's ability to hit Russian logistics and keeping European unity firm. Russia's finances tell a story. It's a story of unsustainable sacrifice, economic deterioration, and shrinking strategic options. And it leads to one conclusion: the Kremlin needs to find a way out because it cannot afford the way that it's in. The war needs to end, and the pressure must continue until the aggressor accepts terms it would never have considered at the start of this disastrous adventure.